Cheating the Gallows by Oliver Zangwill. They say that a union of opposites makes the happiest marriage, and perhaps it is on the same principle that men who chum together are always so oddly assorted. You shall find a man of letters sharing diggings with an auctioneer, and a medical student pigging with a stockbroker's clerk. Perhaps each thus escapes the temptation to talk shop in his hours of leisure, while he supplements his own experiences of life by his companions. There could not be an odder couple than Tom Peters and Everard G. Roxtel. The contrast began with their names and ran through the entire chapter. They had a bedroom and a sitting room in common, but it would not be easy to find what else. To his landlady, worthy Mrs. Seacon, Tom Peters' profession was a little vague, but everybody knew that Roxtel was the manager of the City and Suburban Bank, and it puzzled her to think why a bank manager should live with such a seedy-looking person who smoked clay pipes and sipped whiskey and water all the evening when he was at home. For Roxtel was as spruce and erect as his fellow lodger was round-shouldered and shabby. He never smoked, and he confined himself to a small glass of claret at dinner. It is possible to live with a man and see very little of him. Where each of the partners lives his own life in his own way, with his own circle of friends and external amusements, days may go by without the men having 5 minutes together. Perhaps this explains why these partnerships jog along so much more peaceably than marriages, where the chain is drawn so much tighter and goals are partners rather than links them. Diverse, however, as were the hours and habits of the chums, they often breakfasted together, and they agreed in one thing: they never stayed out at night. For the rest, Peters sought his devotions in the company of journalists and frequented debating rooms where he propounded the most iconoclastic views, while Roxtel had highly respectable houses open to him in the suburbs, and was in fact engaged to be married to Clara Newell, the charming daughter of a retired corn merchant, a widower with no other child. Clara naturally took up a good deal of Roxtel's time, and he often dressed to go to the play with her, while Peters stayed at home in a faded dressing gown and loose slippers. Mrs. Seacon liked to see gentlemen about the house in evening dress, and made comparisons not favourable to Peters, and this in spite of the fact that he gave her infinitely less trouble than the younger man. It was Peters who first took the apartments, and it was characteristic of his easy-going temperament that he was so openly and naively delighted with the view of the Thames obtainable from the bedroom window, that Mrs. Seacon was emboldened to ask 25% more than she had intended. She soon returned to her normal terms, however, when his friend Roxtel called the next day to inspect the rooms, and overwhelmed her with the demonstration of their numerous shortcomings. He pointed out that their being on the ground floor was not an advantage, but a disadvantage, since they were nearer the noises of the street. In fact, the house being a corner one, the noises of 2 streets. Roxtel continued to exhibit the same finicking temperament in the petty details of the ménage. His shirt fronts were never sufficiently starched, nor his boots sufficiently polished. Tom Peters, having no regard for rigid linen, was always good-tempered and satisfied, and never acquired the respect of his landlady. He wore blue check shirts and loose ties, even on Sundays. It is true, he did not go to church, but slept on till Roxtel returned from morning service, and even then it was difficult to get him out of bed or to make him hurry up his toilette operations. Often the midday meal would be smoking on the table, while Peters would smoke in the bed, and Roxtel, with his head thrust through the folding doors that separated the bedroom from the sitting room, would be adjuring the sluggard to arise and shake off his slumbers, and threatening to sit down without him lest the dinner be spoiled. In revenge, Tom was usually up first on weekdays, sometimes at such an earthly hour that Polly had not yet removed the boots from outside the bedroom door, and would bawl down to the kitchen for his shaving water. For Tom, lazy and indolent as he was, shaved with the unfailing regularity of a man to whom shaving has become an instinct. If he had not kept fairly regular hours, Mrs. Seacon would have set him down as an actor, so clean-shaven was he. Roxtel, who did not shave, He wore a full beard, and being a fine figure of a man to boot, now an easy investor could look upon him without being reassured as to the stability of the bank he managed so successfully. And thus the two men lived in an economical comradeship, all the firmer perhaps for their mutual incongruities. It was on a Sunday afternoon in the middle of October, 10 days after Roxdal had settled in his new rooms, that Clara Newell paid her first visit to him there. She enjoyed a good deal of liberty and did not mind accepting his invitation to tea. The corn merchant himself, indifferently educated, had an exaggerated sense of the value of culture, and so Clara, who had artistic tastes without much actual talent, had gone in for painting, and might be seen in pretty toilettes copying pictures in the museum. At one time it looked as if she might be reduced to working seriously at her art, for Satan, who finds mischief still for idle hands to do, had persuaded her father to embark the fruits of years of toil in bubble companies. However, things turned out not so bad as they might have been. A little was saved from the wreck, and the appearance of a suitor, in the person of Everard G. Roxdal, ensured her a future of competence, if not of the luxury she had been entitled to expect. She had a good deal of affection for Everard, who was unmistakably a clever man, as well as a good-looking one. The prospect seemed fair and cloudless. Nothing presaged the terrible storm that was about to break over these two lives. Nothing had ever for a moment come to vex their mutual contentment, till this Sunday afternoon. The October sky, blue and sunny with an Indian summer sultriness, seemed an exact image of her life, with its aftermath of a happiness that had once seemed blighted. Everard had always been so attentive, so solicitous, that she was as much surprised as chagrined to find that he had apparently forgotten the appointment. Hearing her astonished interrogation of Polly in the passage, Tom shambled from the sitting-room in his loose slippers and his blue-check shirt, with his eternal clay pipe in his mouth, and informed her that Roxdal had gone out suddenly, earlier in the afternoon. Gone out? Stammered poor Clara, all confused. But he asked me to come to tea. Oh, you're Miss Newell, I suppose, said Tom. Yes, I am Miss Newell. He's told me a great deal about you, but I wasn't able honestly to congratulate him on his joys till now. Clara blushed uneasily under the compliment and under the ardour of his admiring gaze. Instinctively she distrusted the man. The very first tones of his deeper bass voice gave her a peculiar shudder. And then his impoliteness in smoking that vile clay was so gratuitous. Oh, then you must be Mr. Peters, she said in return. He's often spoken to me of you. Ah, said Tom laughingly. I suppose he's told you all my vices. That accounts for your not being surprised at my Sunday attire. She smiled a little, showing a row of pearly teeth. Everard ascribes to you all the virtues, she said. Now, that's what I call a friend, he cried ecstatically. But won't you come in? He must be back in a moment. He surely wouldn't break an appointment with you. The admiration latent in the accentuation of the last pronoun was almost offensive. She shook her head. She had a just grievance against Everard and would punish him by going away indignantly. Do let me give you a cup of tea, Tom pleaded. You must be awfully thirsty in this sultry weather. There, I'll make a bargain with you. If you come in now, I promise to clear out the moment Everard returns and not spoil your tete-a-tete. But Clara was obstinate. She did not at all relish this man's society, and besides, she was not going to throw away her grievance against Everard. I know Everard will slang me dreadfully when he comes in if I let you go, Tom urged. Tell me at least where he can find you. I'm going to take the bus to Charing Cross, then I'm going straight home, Clara announced determinedly. She put up her parasol in a pet and went up the street into the Strand. A cold shadow seemed to have fallen over all things. But just as she was getting into the bus, A hansom dashed down Trafalgar Square, and a well-known voice hailed her. The hansom stopped, and Everard got out and held out his hand. "I'm so glad you're a bit late," he said. "I was called out unexpectedly, and I've been trying to rush back in time. You wouldn't have found me if you'd been punctual, but I thought," he added laughingly, "I could rely on you as a woman." "I was punctual," Clara said angrily. "I was not getting out of this bus as you seem to imagine, but into it, and was going home." "My darling," he cried remorsefully, "1,000 apologies." The regret on his handsome face soothed her. He took the rose he was wearing in the buttonhole of his fashionably cut coat and gave it to her. "Why were you so cruel?" he murmured, as she nestled against him in the hansom. "Think of my despair. If I had come home to hear you had come and gone, why didn't you wait a moment?" A shudder traversed her frame. "Not with that man Peters," she murmured. "Not with that man Peters?" he echoed sharply. "What's the matter with Peters?" "I don't know," she said. "I don't like him." "Clara," he said, half sternly, half cajolingly, "I thought you were above these feminine weaknesses. You're punctual. Strive also to be reasonable. Tom is my best friend. From boyhood we've been always together. There's nothing Tom wouldn't do for me, or I for Tom. You must like him, Clara, you must, if only for my sake." "I'll try," Clara promised, and then he kissed her in gratitude in broad daylight. "You'll be very nice to him at tea, won't you?" he said anxiously. "I shouldn't like you two to be bad friends." "I don't want to be bad friends," Clara protested. "Only the moment I saw him a strange repulsion and mistrust came over me." "You're quite wrong about him, quite wrong," he assured her earnestly. "When you know him better, you'll find him the best of fellows." "Oh, I know," he said suddenly. "I suppose he was very untidy, and you women go so much by appearances." "Not at all," Clara retorted. "'Tis you men who go by appearances." "Yes, you do. That's why you care for me," he said, smiling. She assured him it wasn't, and she didn't care for him so much as he plumed himself. But he smiled on. His smile died away, however, when he entered his rooms and found Tom nowhere. "I dare say you've made him run about hunting for me," he grumbled. "Perhaps he knew I'd come back and went away to leave us together," she answered. "He said he'd do that when you came. And yet you say you don't like him." She smiled reassuringly. Inwardly, however, she felt pleased at the man's absence. If Clara Newell could have seen Tom Peters carrying on with Polly in the passage, she might have felt justified in her prejudice against him. It must be confessed, though, that Everard also carried on with Polly. Alas, it is to be feared that men are much of a muchness where women are concerned. Shabby men and smart men, bank managers and journalists, bachelors and semi-detached bachelors. Perhaps it was a mistake after all to say the chums had nothing patently in common. Everard, I'm afraid, kissed Polly rather more often than Clara, and although it was because he respected her less, the reason would perhaps not have been sufficiently consoling to his affianced wife, for Polly was pretty, especially on alternate Sunday afternoons, and when at 10 p.m. she returned from her outings, she was generally met in the passage by one or other of the men. Polly liked to receive the homage of real gentlemen, and set her white cap at all indifferently. Thus, just before Clara knocked on that memorable Sunday afternoon, Polly, being confined to the house by the unwritten code regulating the lives of servants, was amusing herself by flirting with Peters. "You are fond of me, a little bit," the graceless Tom whispered. "Aren't you?" "You know I am, sir," Polly replied. "You don't care for anyone else in the house?" "Oh, no, sir, and never let anyone kiss me but you." "I wonder how it is, sir," Polly replied ingenuously. "Give me another," Tom answered. She gave him another and tripped to the door to answer Clara's knock. And that very evening, when Clara was gone and Tom still out, Polly turned without the faintest atom of scrupulosity or even jealousy to the more fascinating Roxtel and accepted his amorous advances. If it would seem at first sight that Everard had less excuse for such a frivolity than his friend, perhaps the seriousness he showed in this interview may throw a different light upon the complex character of the man. "You're quite sure you don't care for anyone but me?" he asked earnestly. "Of course not, sir," Polly replied indignantly. "How could I? But you care for that soldier I saw you out with last Sunday." "Oh, no, sir, he's only my young man," she said apologetically. "Would you give him up?" he hissed suddenly. Polly's pretty face took a look of terror. I couldn't, sir. He'd kill me. He's such a jealous brute. You've no idea." "Yes, but suppose I took you away from here," he whispered eagerly. "Somewhere where he couldn't find you. South America, Africa, somewhere thousands of miles across the sea." "Oh, sir, you frighten me," whispered Polly, cowering before his ardent eyes which shone in the dimly lit passage. "Would you come with me?" he hissed. She did not answer. She shook herself free and ran into the kitchen, trembling with a vague fear. One morning, earlier than his earliest hour of demanding his shaving water, Tom rang the bell violently and asked the alarmed Polly what had become of Mr. Roxdal. "But how should I know, sir?" she gasped. "Ain't he been in, sir?" "Apparently not," Tom answered anxiously. "He never remains out. We've been here 3 weeks now, and I can't recall a single night he hasn't been home before 12. I can't make it out." All inquiries proved futile. Mrs. Seacon reminded him of the thick fog that had come on suddenly the night before. "What fog?" asked Tom. "Lord, didn't you notice it, sir?" "No, I came in early, smoked red, and went to bed about 11. I never thought of looking out of the window. Began about 10, said Mrs. Seacon, and got thicker and thicker. I couldn't see the lights of the river from my bedroom. The poor gentleman had been and gone and walked into the water." She began to whimper. "Nonsense, nonsense," said Tom, though his expression belied his words. "At the worst, I should think he couldn't find his way home, and couldn't get a cab, so put up for the night at some hotel. I dare say it'll be all right." He began to whistle, as if in restored cheerfulness. At 8 o'clock, there came a letter for Roxdal, marked immediate. But as he did not turn up for breakfast, Tom went round personally to the City and Suburban Bank. He waited half an hour there, but the manager did not make his appearance. Then he left a letter with the cashier and went away with anxious countenance. That afternoon it was all over London that the manager of the City and Suburban had disappeared, and that many £1,000s of gold and notes had disappeared with him. Scotland Yard opened the letter marked immediate and noted that there had been a delay in its delivery, for the address had been obscure, and an official alteration had been made. It was written in a feminine hand, and said, "On second thoughts, I cannot accompany you. Do not try to see me again. Forget me. I shall never forget you." There was no signature. Clara Newell, distracted, disclaimed all knowledge of this letter. Polly deposed that the fugitive had proposed flight to her, and the routes to Africa and South America were especially watched. Some months passed, without result. Tom Peters went about overwhelmed with grief and astonishment. The police took possession of all the missing man's effects. Gradually the hue and cry dwindled, died. "At last we meet," cried Tom Peters, while his face lit up in joy. "How are you, dear Miss Newell?" Clara greeted him coldly. Her face had an abiding pallor now. Her lover's flight and shame had prostrated her for weeks. Her soul was the arena of contending instincts. Alone of all the world, she still believed in Everard's innocence, felt that there was something more than met the eye, divined some devilish mystery behind it all. And yet that damning letter from the anonymous lady shook her sadly. Then, too, there was a deposition of Polly. When she heard Peter's voice accosting her, all her old repugnance resurged. It flashed upon her that this man, Roxdal's boon companion, must know far more than he had told to the police. She remembered how Everard had spoken of him, with what affection and confidence. Was it likely he was utterly ignorant of Everard's movements? Mastering her repugnance, she held out her hand. It might be well to keep in touch with him. He was possibly the clue to the mystery. She noticed he was dressed a shade more trimly and was smoking a meerschaum. He walked along at her side, making no offer to put his pipe out. "You have not heard from Everard?" he asked. She flushed. "Do you think I'm an accessory after the fact?" she cried. "No, no," he said soothingly. "Pardon me. I was thinking he might have written, giving no exact address, of course. Men do sometimes dare to write thus to women, but, of course, he knows you too well. You would put the police on his track." "Certainly," she exclaimed indignantly. "Even if he is innocent, he must face the charge." "Do you still entertain the possibility of his innocence?" "I do," she said boldly, and looked him full in the face. His eyelids drooped with a quiver. "Don't you?" "I have hoped against hope," he replied in a voice faltering with emotion. "Poor old Everard. But I'm afraid there's no room for doubt. Oh, this wicked curse of money, tempting the noblest and the best of us." The weeks rolled on. Gradually she found herself seeing more and more of Tom Peters, and gradually, strange to say, he grew less repulsive. From the talks they had together, she began to see that there was really no reason to put faith in Everard. His criminality, his faithlessness, were too flagrant. Gradually she grew ashamed of her early mistrust of Peters. Remorse bred esteem, and esteem ultimately ripened into feelings so warm that when Tom gave freer vent to the love that had been visible to Clara from the first, she did not repulse him. It is only in books that love lives forever. Clara, so her father thought, showed herself a sensible girl in plucking out an unworthy affection and casting it from her heart. He invited the new lover to his house and took to him at once. Roxdal's somewhat supercilious manner had always jarred upon the unsophisticated corn merchant. With Tom, the old man got on much better, while evidently quite as well informed and cultured as his whilom friend. Tom knew how to impart his superior knowledge with the accent on the knowledge rather than on the superiority, while he had the air of gaining much information in return. Those who are most conscious of defects of early education are most resentful of other people sharing their consciousness. Moreover, Tom's bonhomie was far more to the old fellow's liking than the studied politeness of his predecessor. So that on the whole, Tom made more of a conquest of the father than of the daughter. Nevertheless, Clara was by no means unresponsive to Tom's affection, and when, after one of his visits to the house, the old man kissed her fondly and spoke of the happy turn things had taken, and how, for the second time in their lives, things had mended when they seemed the dead blackest, her heart swelled with a gush of gratitude and joy and tenderness, and she fell sobbing into her father's arms. Tom calculated that he made a clear 500 a year by occasional journalism, besides possessing some profitable investments which he'd inherited from his mother, so that there was no reason for delaying the marriage. It was fixed for May Day, and the honeymoon was to be spent in Italy. But Clara was not destined to happiness. From the moment she had promised herself to her first love's friend, old memories began to rise up and reproach her. Strange thoughts stirred in the depths of her soul, and in the silent watches of the night she seemed to hear Everard's accents charged with grief and upbraiding. Her uneasiness increased as her wedding day drew near. One night, after a pleasant afternoon spent in being rowed by Tom among the upper reaches of the Thames, she retired to rest full of vague forebodings. And she dreamt a terrible dream. The dripping form of Everard stood by her bedside, staring at her with ghastly eyes. Had he been drowned on the passage to his land of exile? Frozen with horror, she put the question. "I have never left England," the vision answered. Her tongue clove to the roof of her mouth. "Never left England," she repeated in tones which did not seem to be hers. The wraith's stony eyes stared on, but there was silence. "Where have you been, then?" she asked in her dream. "Very near you," came the answer. "There has been foul play, then," she shrieked. The phantom shook its head in doleful assent. "I knew it," she shrieked. "Tom Peters. Tom Peters has done away with you. Is it not he? Speak." "Yes, it is he, Tom Peters, whom I loved more than all the world." Even in the terrible oppression of the dream, she could not resist saying, woman-like, "Did I not warn you against him?" The phantom stared on silently and made no reply. "But what was his motive?" she asked at length. "Love of gold. And you. And you are giving yourself to him," it said sternly. "No, no, Everard, I will not, I swear. Forgive me." The spirit shook its head skeptically. "You love him. Women are false as men." She strove to protest again, but her tongue refused its office. "If you marry him, I shall always be with you. Beware." The dripping figure vanished as suddenly as it came, and Clara awoke in cold perspiration. Oh, it was horrible. The man she had learnt to love, the murderer of the man she had learnt to forget. How her original prejudice had been justified. Distracted, shaken to her depths, she would not take counsel even of her father, but informed the police of her suspicions. A raid was made on Tom's rooms, and lo, the stolen notes were discovered in a huge bundle. It was found that he had several banking accounts, with a large, recently paid amount in each bank. Tom was arrested. Attention was now concentrated on the corpses washed up by the river. It was not long before the body of Roxtel came to shore, the face distorted almost beyond recognition by long immersion, but the clothes patently his, and a pocketbook in the breast pocket, removing the last doubt. Mrs. Seacon and Polly and Clara Newell all identified the body. Both juries returned a verdict of murder against Tom Peters. The recital of Clara's dream producing a unique impression in the court and throughout the country. The theory of the prosecution was that Roxtel had brought home the money, whether to fly alone or to divide it, or whether even for some innocent purposes Clara believed was immaterial. That Peters determined to have it all, that he had gone out for a walk with the deceased and taking advantage of the fog had pushed him into the river, and that he was further impelled to the crime by love for Clara Newell, as was evident from his subsequent relations with her. The judge put on the black cap. Tom Peters was duly hung by the neck till he was dead. Brief resume of the culprit's confession. When you all read this, I shall be dead and laughing at you. I have been hung for my own murder. I am Everard G. Roxtel. I am also Tom Peters. We two were one. When I was a young man, my moustache and beard wouldn't come. I bought false ones to improve my appearance. One day, after I had become manager of the City and Suburban Bank, I took off my beard and moustache at home, and then the thought crossed my mind that nobody would know me without them. I was another man. Instantly it flashed upon me. But if I ran away from the bank, that other man could be left in London, while the police were scouring the world for a non-existent fugitive. But this was only the crude germ of the idea. Slowly I matured my plan. The man who was going to be left in London must be known to a circle of acquaintance beforehand. It will be easy enough to masquerade in the evenings in my beardless condition with other disguises of dress and voice. But this was not brilliant enough. I conceived the idea of living with him. It was Box and Cox reversed. We shared rooms at Mrs. Seacon's. It was a great strain, but it was only for a few weeks. I had trick clothes in my bedroom like those of quick-change artistes. In a moment I could pass from Roxtel to Peters and from Peters to Roxtel. Polly had to clean 2 pairs of boots a morning, cook 2 dinners, etc. Or the other of us every moment. It never dawned upon them that they never saw us both together. At meals I would not be interrupted, ate off 2 plates, and conversed with my friend in loud tones. At other times, We dined at different hours. On Sundays, he was supposed to be asleep while I was at church. There's no landlady in the world to whom the idea would have occurred that one man was troubling himself to be two, and to pay for two, including washing. I worked up the idea of Roxtel's flight and asked Polly to go with me, manufactured that feminine letter that arrived on the morning of my disappearance. As Tom Peters, I mixed with a journalistic set. I had another room where I kept the golden notes till I mistakenly thought the thing had blown over. Unfortunately, returning from here on the night of my disappearance, with Roxtel's clothes in the bundle, I intended to drop them in the river. It was stolen from me in the fog, and the man into whose possession it ultimately came appears to have committed suicide. What perhaps ruined me was my desire to keep Clara's love and to transfer it to the survivor. Everard told her I was the best of fellows. Once married to her, I wouldn't have had much fear. Even if she had discovered the trick, a wife cannot give evidence against her husband, and often does not want to. I made none of the usual slips, but no man can guard against the girl's nightmare after a day up the river and the supper at the Star and Garter. I might have told the judge he was an ass, but then I should have had penal servitude for bank robbery, and that is worse than death. The only thing that puzzles me, though, is whether the law has committed murder, or I, suicide. If you like that story, consider supporting me as a patron. That way you help me make more stories for you and get access to a patrons-only library of stories, lots more hours for you to listen to. So that was Cheating the Gallows, written by Oliver Zangwill. I looked up the pronunciation of his second name, thinking it might be a Yiddish name, so Zangwill or something like that, but the internet says Zangwill. So Zangwill was born in 1864 in Whitechapel, I think, in London's East End, which was a centre of Jewish immigration at the time. His father was from Latvia, and his mother was from what is present-day Poland. And he had a very deep sense of his Jewish identity. And it's a really interesting, and it's a theme that occurs in his writing and his thinking. This, but perhaps conflict between assimilation of Jewish populations into the countries they emigrate into, or separate developments, such as in Zionism, or we'll talk about that a bit as well. So he was educated at the Jews' Free School in London, and he had a rigorous curriculum, both religious and secular subjects. And this was in the midst of the deep poverty of the East End. But he was a brilliant student. He excelled there, and he even became a teacher there. And then later on, he did, or similar time when he was teaching there, he went to the University of London and earned a Bachelor of Arts with triple honours in 1884. So he was a bright man. And his writing was diverse and multifaceted, and he wrote novels, plays, short stories, essays, and journalism. And he actually began as a journalist, which is interesting, given that the things he says about Tom Peters and his journalistic circle, this is a world that he's very familiar with. And he wrote for the London press. His breakthrough came with a novel called Children of the Ghetto that offered a detailed and sympathetic portrayal of Jewish immigrant life in London's East End. Then he wrote Ghetto Tragedies, and he became a significant voice in Anglo-Jewish literature. And he was compared to Charles Dickens of his vivid portrayals of the poor people living in London. He was a playwright as well. He lived in the USA for a bit, and he wrote The Melting Pot, about the metaphor of America as a crucible for cultural assimilation, and it became a sensation in the US. And he wrote other plays exploring themes of identity, social justice, and challenges of modernity. He had a realistic, in a sense of, this is 1880, late 1890s this came out. So it's perhaps realistic for its time. And the people who depict in that story, they're not ultimately wealthy, they're not lords and ladies, but they're not dirt poor either. They live in a boarding house, and they have, even though they're paying, they don't have their own servants, but they have servants doing things for them. It comes as part of the deal. So, his speech he was particularly adept at capturing the nuances of Jewish speech and culture serving as a bridge between Jewish and non-Jewish audiences. And he wrote, as we see here, he ventured into genre fiction, particularly detective fiction, and wrote a mystery novel called The Big Bow Mystery, which remains a classic of the locked room mystery subgenre. We've talked about that in other episodes. Locked room stories. This isn't a locked room story, although it's a very clever story, I think. It's a very clever story. At the very end, you think, oh, is it too clever by half? But that's part of the joy of some of these. They become very often detective stories, and they're taken to their extreme. They pretend to be, to a greater or lesser extent, they pretend to be naturalistic descriptions of a crime. And I think our modern detective novels and crime novels, they do that. That's what they do. They pretend to be. This is almost like you're reading in a newspaper. Then you go further back in the Golden Age, and they are puzzles, aren't they? And in many cases, they are just like a Sudoku puzzle. And you think of the great popularity of puzzles and crosswords, cryptic crosswords, things like that, and they are more like that. So, and we say this about speech in novels, and particularly in novels, we go through the naturalistic turn. So it is written as if someone might say these things and someone might do these things, but in reality, we know nobody actually behaves in such a coherent way, speaks so coherently, has purpose in everything they do. They're just stories, novels are not natural. That is not how people are, but yet we pretend we have this convention. We maybe even kid ourselves that they are, but of course they are not. So listen, Zangwill was a real liberal progressive. He was a big advocate for pacifism and feminism. Now, this is very interesting because if this comment he makes about women and women's tendencies of thought, of dress, of or how they think about appearance, they appear to be very stereotypical, and I think it probably wouldn't last long in a room with, is it third wave feminist? I'm not sure about how many waves have been. It's not for me, that world, because I'm for the wrong kind. But the one thing I thought when I was reading this story, and I'm doing this thing about his life, is I could just see the comments coming in. So there's just another one for you, a comment food. As long as we can discuss these things good-humouredly, I think that's fine. It's when things degenerate into just ridiculous slanging matches is the problem. Anyway, align himself with feminism, very much a strong belief in the equal rights of women and opportunities for women. And that was a big challenge to the patriarchal norms of Victorian and Edwardian society. He believed in women's suffrage, argued for greater female participation in public life, and although that he may seem paternalistic, as my notes say, talking about more the moral influence of women rather than their absolute autonomy, but they were progressive for his time. And what is Clara Newell? There are two females really, and well, there's Mrs. Seacombe as well. She doesn't get much of a look in. But we have Polly, who I think's nicely caricatured, of a pretty young girl who enjoys her power over men, as many young girls do. And Clara, who's a bit stuffy. I didn't really warm to Clara, to be honest. I like Polly a lot more. No comments coming in now. And then he was a pacifist. The horrors of the First World War only strengthened his commitment to pacifism. He saw war as a destructive force that undermined human progress and perpetuated injustice. So he remained steadfast even during the times of, when you were given a white feather and called a coward and things like that. He remained committed to both social justice and human rights, and he was a Zionist. So he interestingly made a comment so let's talk about his Zionism. He was a big supporter of Theodore Herzl and Zionism, and this was against a background of rising anti-Semitism in Europe and the perceived need for a secure Jewish homeland. Remember, his parents had come fleeing pogroms, so it was something he was very familiar with. And He was an associate of Herzl, as I said, and promoted Zionism in Britain and beyond. His literary platforms and his essays and public speeches became a vehicle for disseminating Zionist ideas and garnering support. He presided over meetings addressed by Herzl, and he was really, really committed, particularly with the initial goal of establishing a Jewish state in Palestine. He says in 1902, he's documented, and this is for somebody, it's like being on the internet now, isn't it? Everything you say is kept forever. Even though your views may change, you will be held to what you said many years before. So in 1902, his view was that Palestine was an almost uninhabited, forsaken and ruined Turkish territory. At this time, remember, Palestine is a province of the Ottoman, the Turkish Empire. And so later on, after the dismantling of the Ottoman Empire, after they were defeated in the First World War, and the British and the French stepped in as occupying powers in the Levant. So at 1902, they may be talking about going back to Palestine, but I don't know enough about it whether the Turks did allow them back in. I'm feeling that it wasn't a big. It was really doing the British Mandate, wasn't it? In any case, then he comes to the idea that there's rather than being uninhabited, there's 600,000 indigenous Arab people there, and this made he became increasingly concerned about the demographic realities, recognizing the presence of a significant Arab population posed a challenge to that Zionist project. He wasn't wrong, was he? This realization, coupled with his pragmatic approach, led him to embrace territorialism, the idea of establishing a Jewish homeland in any suitable location, so that he's abandoning the historical and religious significance, which I think is interesting given his ideas about the melting pot in America. So he clearly sees, in the melting pot, he sees the possibility of people moving somewhere that they don't belong to, indigenously, and being able to operate as full citizens to make it their own home, And I think this is perhaps this is related to his shift from mainstream Zionism with its focus on Palestine to this territorialist, let's not pretend that would have been unproblematic, So he was thinking about Uganda in Africa or Argentina. It's difficult to see how the same problems wouldn't arise. So a really interesting guy. He died in 1926 in Midhurst in Sussex. He had chronic heart disease, and he'd had this for a while, but suddenly his health declined. But suddenly his end was sudden. And he was major obituaries in newspapers in Britain and internationally, acknowledging his contributions to literature, political thought, and which is really interesting given is mostly forgotten now. And he was buried in the Jewish cemetery in Willesden in London, so the city that he was born in. Let's think about this story, Cheating the Gallows. Initially published as a short story in 1893, it appeared in The King of Schnorr's Grotesques and Fantasies, a collection of Zangwill's shorter works that showcased his versatility. The King of Schnorr's is a novel, but the volume also contained several short stories, including this, and it has been reprinted in various anthologies of mystery and crime fiction. It struck me that, without any spoilers, I've just done a story for the Ghost channel, set in 1790s in England by Marjorie Bowen, called The Bishop of Hell. It is, the similarity is, most of the stories are naturalistic, and both of these is not supernatural at all. So, like, 9/10 of both of these stories are not supernatural, and in the end, there is some kind of supernatural visitation to do with revenge. In both stories, no spoilers. But I chose but The Bishop of Hell is considered a ghost story, whereas this is considered a detective story. I think that portrays a common origin of both genres. Did you see it coming is the question. That is a comment I welcome. Did you see it coming? I didn't. I absolutely didn't. I hadn't read the story before, and I thought, I was just going to read it, a fresh de novo, as they might say. And so I'm like, no. And my first thought was, get out of here. I thought this is too clever by half, particularly the very sort of smug little rejoinder, as if you'd do that. A deathbed confession. What do you? You'd have time, wouldn't you? Musing idly whether legally it is a murder or a suicide. I wasn't too sure about that. But then when you look back, it's disbelief was my first. I thought, oh, come on, surely. So I went back through it. And then when you go back through it again, you see, oh, this is actually really clever. So the stark contrast between Peters and Rockstall, they've been together ever since they're an odd couple. He sets that up by saying, well, this often happens, doesn't it? And they have different and definite personalities and habits. They move in different circles. And this idea that one's always late for lunch and he has to call him down, and he must have been fat as butter, eating two lunches and two breakfasts. And then, of course, when we look, they're never together, are they? They're just never together. One case, Peters is there and Rockstall's coming back on the bus. And then when they get back to the flat, Gladow's gone, Peters is gone. You think, oh, yeah. And poor old Polly, and they're both trying it on with poor old Polly. I'm said poor old Polly, but things that young people get up to, you wouldn't believe. And I don't. And he converses, and then the only slight thing was about the body being found in he's eaten by fish, so you can't tell him by his face, but he's got the pocketbook and the clothes. The idea that his clothes that he set down were taken by somebody else who then conveniently killed themselves, that seemed to me a little bit of a slip. But even though it's not perfect, I liked the story. I thought it made me smile at the end. I thought, oh, come on. But then when I read through it, I thought, oh, that's interesting. That's really clever. Nearly perfect, nearly good, 100%, but still pretty good and pretty enjoyable. Final point is that I will talk about authors, no matter what their political views, no matter what society thinks of them. So on the ghost story, I mentioned Neil Gaiman. I don't know what Neil Gaiman did. He hasn't been through the process of law. It's not for me to judge him. And all I'm going to talk about Neil Gaiman is his work, Saying goes, this guy, you might not like us, not you, but somebody might not like the idea that he was a liberal. Some people might not like the idea that he was a Zionist. That isn't what I'm about now. I'm not going to censor people. I'm not going to not talk about certain. Vladimir Nabokov, Lolita, he liked young girls. Not saying Nabokov did, but the character did. Should I not talk about that? I've done that. Nabokov's brilliant. Erwin Schrödinger, the great physicist, like the young girls or mid-teen girls. It's not for me to say. I'm not commenting on that. And I won't censor, And also the other thing, the final thing is on trigger warnings. I'm really sorry if some of these authors trigger people, but those are some sign up, Your triggers are your responsibility. I simply can't second guess